Everybody, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Tyson Stockton, and I am the VP of Client Services here at Searchmetrics. And today we're going to be going over the topic of Google Core Web Vitals. So today we're going to be kind of looking at Core Web Vitals. We're looking at Core Web Vitals and as far as at an enterprise or scalable business. And this, we're going to be diving into actionable tips, breaking down kind of elements of LCP, FID, and CLS, and then also kind of sharing, how to think about this if you are managing a larger website and enterprise business, and kind of what our approach has been here at Searchmetrics to this. So before we jump into the actual webinar, we're going to do a little bit of kind of housekeeping here. So one thing to kind of note is this is a live Q&A. So as we're going through the webinar, definitely use the Q&A option down at the bottom of the screen. Those questions will immediately go into us. So we will see those as we're talking. And then at the end of the session, we'll be doing a question answer, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can. So definitely encourage you guys, if there's anything that you need more details or more clarity around, go ahead and send in those questions, and we'll be seeing them as they come in. The next thing to kind of note is there's also a workshop resource kind of at the bottom of the screen as well. Here we've loaded in a few different assets that you guys can download along with the presentation. We also have kind of a landing page with some additional other resources around Core Web Vitals. Some of those things include the recent podcasts on Voices of Search that both Kathy and Karl were featured on, talking about Core Web Vitals, and a few other resources that we think will be helpful for you guys. So last piece before we get into the actual conversation, a little bit about Searchmetrics. At Searchmetrics, we believe in the power of insights to help marketers make better decisions and produce meaningful results. Backed by our data, software, and services, Searchmetrics customers enjoys the sustainability of organic search with the predictability success of paid media. Searchmetrics is used by the digital marketers in every vertical, includes Fortune 500, enterprise, and e-commerce customers. And with that, who I'm joined today, I'm joined here with Kathy Brown, one of our senior SEO managers at Searchmetrics. Kathy's been in the industry for quite some time, over a decade of experience in technical SEO, working with large enterprise, growing B2Bs and global e-commerce brands to improve their online visibility. At Searchmetrics, Kathy partners with some of our largest clients, working directly with senior marketing and product managers to grow revenue by increasing organic traffic. We're also joined today with Karl Kleinschmidt. Karl Kleinschmidt is also one of our senior SEO managers, and he works with the services team at Searchmetrics. Karl has over 11 years of experience in SEO, works with top kind of e-commerce brands, specializes in schema, large-scale page generation. Karl covers topics around schema, large-scale data analysis, ranking shifts, specializes in e-commerce, also has a keen eye and interest in machine learning and finding different solutions to automate SEO at scale. As mentioned before, I'm your host, Tyson Stockton. I'm the VP of Client Services here at Searchmetrics. Have over 10 years experience in the digital marketing industry. Over the last 5 years, I've been at Searchmetrics and supporting some of the world's largest e-commerce and enterprise websites, including Fortune 500 and global e-commerce leaders. With that, let's jump into the actual subject and topic at hand today. So the areas within Core Web Vitals that we're going to be discussing is, one, we're going to kind of just level set and, make sure we're all on the same page of, the basics of what Core Web Vitals are. And we're going to kind of go into a little bit of kind of snippets that you can use to help make the case for Core Web Vitals in your business. We're going to break down then again, some of the elements and common factors that go into LCP, FID, and CLS. And then kind of moving us closer into how do we actually bring this into practice? We're going to be breaking down field versus lab data. And then ultimately, how do you approach Core Web Vitals for scaling in a large enterprise business? So this will be a little bit more of a technical webinar that we're going to be covering. But really, this is going to be I think a hot topic for the entire year. It's something that we've all heard about over the last 12 months or so, and something that we certainly won't stop hearing about this year as we see how this actually impacts the rankings. But with that, I will pass it over to our speakers. And Kathy, how about you start us out on making the case for Core Web Vitals?
Yeah, awesome, Tyson. Thank you. So I think most people who are on this webinar, and by the way, hi, I'm Kathy Brown. Thanks so much for joining us. Probably already know what Core Web Vitals are, but let's just make sure we're all on the same page. So back in the summer, in July, Google pre-announced the page experience ranking factor. And page experience has multiple components to it. It includes existing ranking factors such as mobile friendliness, safe search, HTTPS, and the intrusive interstitial mobile penalty. So those are existing, but it also includes or will include Core Web Vitals, which were fairly new. I mean, those of you who've been doing technical SEO for a while have most definitely been looking at page speed, because that is an existing ranking factor. And so we're all familiar with Google Lighthouse and first Contentful paint and things like that. But what's kind of new here is that it's a more holistic view of page experience. So it's not just about how quickly you can paint stuff above the fold, so we keep our user engaged and on the site. It's also about, well, is the page reasonably interactive, and is the page visually stable? So it's just a more holistic look at the page experience, and that's what Google is rolling out in May 2021. So as I mentioned, back in the summer, this was a pre-announcement, and then in the fall, we got the sort of red flag saying, okay, you got 6 months before this is going to roll out in May 2021. And I just want to take a moment here just to point out that it's not particularly common for Google to pre-announce stuff. Usually it's a little more of a surprise when Google puts things out there. And in this case, we got almost a year's notice that this was coming. So given that Google pre-announced it and gave us so much time, Google must think it's important. So okay, it's important, and I think most people on this webinar agree it's something you need to take a look at. But then the next question is, okay, how can I get the rest of the organization to agree it's important and invest in making our Core Web Vitals better? And it can be a challenge. You know, Core Web Vitals is a very technical, geeky topic, and it's pretty easy to be the person in the room that's talking about, well, you know, we need to use lazy loading more, and our pages are not very visually stable. And then you see the eyes glaze over of the other people in the room. So that's a challenge. And then you might get the question like, well, how important will it be for our site's rankings? And that's a challenge to answer, because to be honest, we really don't know until May how much it's going to impact various sites. I think it's going to depend on the type of site you have, the industry you're in, and how competitive that industry is. So the question is, well, how can we make the case for Core Web Vitals? How can we get the rest of the organization to agree to invest in improvements? And, you know, one way to do that is to just be really clear about how much your site is in compliance. So if it's just a section of your site or whether it's the whole site, I think that's a very clear thing to be able to communicate on. And we'll get more into that as we get deeper into this webinar. But the other thing I really want to point out is, yes, it's important for SEO. Yes, it's likely to impact your rankings, but Core Web Vitals is not just about SEO. So Google did some research before they came up with the thresholds for the Core Web Vitals, and they found that when a site meets the Core Web Vital thresholds, users are 24% less likely to abandon page loads. And that's pretty significant. 24% is not anything to sneeze at. And that's a direct quote from Google, and you'll see it down there at the bottom of your slide. So I think it's important to maybe tell the organization or the people you're working with that it's not just about SEO, that it may have a material impact on KPIs that the organization really cares about. And we could just take a look at some of these case studies that I have on the slide. For example, Pinterest increased signups by 15% by reducing perceived wait times by 40%. That is significant growth there, and something that I think the people at Pinterest would really care about. And by reducing the average page load by 850 milliseconds, Cook saw conversions increase by 7%. Another really nice growth metric. And then finally, Mobify increased annual revenue by nearly 380,000 by decreasing the home page load speed. So I think it's important to not only say, hey, Core Web Vitals is coming, it's going to have an impact on our rankings, but to also identify the key KPIs that the organization really cares about and point out that Core Web Vitals, improving them will have a material impact on those KPIs as well. So some food for thought as you make your case and as you talk to your development partners and other partners you have in the organization on how you can make the case for Core Web Vitals. All right, Tyson, back to you.
Thanks, Kathy. I think, you hit on some key points there, and, selfishly as an SEO, I'm looking at Core Web Vitals of like, how can I improve my rankings, or what impact will this have on my rankings? But then in building the business case to actually get the buy-in in the organization to then bring those recommendations to life, I think some of those points that you hit on is a really key element. I've seen some great success in organizations, especially in the e-com space, of kind of pointing and justifying getting this work picked up because of things like the impact of conversion rate and the revenue that you can actually tie to it. So I think that's excellent advice kind of leading into the conversation. If you are looking to make the case within your organization around Core Web Vitals to get this picked up by engineering, don't think just in the viewpoint of SEO, but think of it, how does it impact the user experience as a whole, because you have a stronger case in that sense. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to Karl to kind of break down some of the elements and some things that we need to be aware of in forms of LCP, FID, and CLS. So Karl, over to you.
Thanks, Tyson. So one of the big difference between Core Web Vitals and page speed, for instance, is that we have direct feedback from Google what good needs improvement and poor is, instead of just being relative to your competitors. So the goal should be to have all your scores in good, but sometimes that's not feasible. So at least be better than your competitors, but we actually have exact feedback on what we should do. And I just wanted to go over the three so that we're all on the same page, what the three metrics are, and then go through some common causes of negative scores. So largest contentful paint is how long does the largest element on your page take to load. And by largest, it is not by file size, but in the viewport, how large is the image. Then for first input delay, we have how long after a customer has interacted with the website does the website respond. And then cumulative layout shift is how much does your web page change its layout or move around without user interaction. And so the score for CLS is calculated by how much of the screen is taken up multiplied by how much it moved. The details of how that's calculated is slightly more complicated, but that's a great simple explanation for how that score is calculated, because it's not in seconds like the other two. Largest contentful paint, slow loading resources and render blocking assets are the biggest problems with largest contentful paint. or Google picking a largest contentful paint element that you don't want it to pick. That most of the time that is caused by a problem in the load sequence of the elements. And sometimes your LCP score is artificially inflated because you're doing a repaint or the viewport changes so much that Google is of the opinion that it needs to restart the LCP timer. So look at what is happening in your viewport and look at what is Google picking for the LCP. For first input delay, it's 100% dependent on how your JavaScript works. It can be difficult to diagnose because it is only a field metric. You're not getting any lab data feedback. And if you have main thread blocking tasks that are longer than 50 milliseconds, you should look at them and see if you can make them shorter. For CLS, it's, as I said, it is unexpected movement. Banners and ads are the most frequent culprits, and it's relatively easy to diagnose and fix if the elements that are moving are visible. We've had clients get bad CLS scores, even though the elements that were moving were 1 pixel big. So that's going to be harder to diagnose. Then you have to use the lab data. But if you can see it move, then it's relatively easy to diagnose and fix. One of the biggest things to look out for is that the lab tools only measure what happens on page load, while field data includes all the scrolling. So if a viewer scrolls and then 500 milliseconds after they scroll, your elements are still moving, your field data is going to be negatively affected. And so it might be easy, it might be hard. This is either the easiest one to diagnose or the hardest one to diagnose. All depends on your site. And so what we at Searchmetrics did is we built a tool that allows us to do this analysis at scale. So if a client comes to us, what we do is we take their domain and pull the top keywords for the domain. And then for each of those keywords, we pull the top 10 ranking URLs. And then all those URLs get run through the Lighthouse analysis. So we don't only get the lab scores, we get all the details that are used to generate the page speed insights report. We can simulate all of that. And that allows us to easily compare the values to our competitors and see where the priority is to fix. This has also allowed us to do an overall large analysis of what is the correlation between the values and position. Since the update hasn't happened, there's almost zero correlation. We currently have around 60,000 keywords analyzed. And as you can see, it's not negative or positive correlation. There is just zero correlation. The other thing that we do is we automatically calculate for all the pages that we analyze what percentage of the LCP elements are images versus text. The images versus text are very different ways of diagnosing the LCP problem, so it's important to know where you need to put your effort. Then the other thing that we do is we compare the domain's values to their competitors' values. For each, since we always pull the top 10 URLs, we can average the values, in this case LCP, for the competitors, and then compare it to the URLs that are ranking for the domain that we're analyzing in those same ranking slots.
So I found this particular slide really interesting, because when I look at this, I'm realizing that the LCP for the first position is way higher than the LCP for the remaining positions. Why would that be? You would think that if it's really a slow page, Google wouldn't give it a first position. But in this case, it seems to, and we have a page that's just really slow here.
So the biggest cause that I have found is that pages like the home page often rank in first place for branded terms, where there's very little competition, and home pages tend to have worse Core Web Vitals scores than other pages. And so that's the biggest cause of this graph that we found with our clients, that it's the pages that are ranking in first place are often for branded keywords, and there's not as much competition there.
Yeah, and I guess with home pages, they're very image heavy, so that does make sense.
Yeah. We do the same thing with CLS, where we rank it compared to your competitors. Right? In this case, with these two example graphs, the LCP for those pages ranking in first place would definitely be a priority, unless it's for a very non-competitive term. For CLS, this sample set is doing better compared to competitors, but still not in the excellent range. So there's still some work to do. One of the things you might notice is that there is not one of these graphs for FID, because there is no lab data for FID. So the closest values we have are total blocking time and max FID, but understanding the difference where to use lab data and where to use field data is important when diagnosing the problems that you're having.
Excellent. Thank you, Karl. I think, one that gives us a great kind of starting point, identifying, those elements that are being kind of the biggest culprits. But you bring up a really interesting point within field versus lab data. And I know that Google's made quite an effort of having Core Web Vitals scores available in a variety of kind of different tools. And, with our approach, I think it's, it's also quite interesting looking at it of not just kind of your own domain. We know the absolutes that Google's provided, but how does that really kind of share with, your market? But maybe you could just expand a little bit further. And I did see a question come in asking kind of like, what is the difference between field versus lab data? So can you kind of expand on that aspect a little bit?
Sure. So field versus lab. Field is the average of the visitors that are actually going to the pages. Lab is simulated scores in the Lighthouse tool. And so this is a great example of why lab versus field is important. The top set of data is field data. So where you can see that this website or this specific page has an LCP of 3.2 on average when it comes to visitors, but the lab, the Lighthouse tool, estimates the largest Contentful paint to be 18 seconds. And then if you look at CLS, the difference is big in the other way, where in the field, things are moving all over the place. In the lab, that's not happening. And so the most common causes of large discrepancies between field versus lab is logged in versus not logged in. I'm sure most of you, when someone logs into your site, your header can change. There's pop-ups that might not appear. The Lighthouse tool can't log in, but you need the Lighthouse tool to diagnose your problems. So thinking about what are the differences between a completely new person that's going to your site that can't scroll, but only sees what they're being served, versus someone that has been to your site before, looks around, and has certain cookies that disable banners or pop-ups. Think about those two, and those are the biggest differences in field versus lab. Another thing is that lab has a very specific set of criteria, right? It's using a specific phone on a specific operating system, and most of your users are probably not going to be using that phone and operating system. So that could cause another big difference. Cached images, especially for LCP, can cause a big difference because it measures how long it takes for that image to load. If a returning visitor already has that image cached, it will load significantly faster than someone that has never been to the site before. And the Lighthouse tool also doesn't scroll. So if a user is scrolling and things are moving around, your CLS field data will be worse than your lab because the Lighthouse tool just loaded the page and didn't scroll at all.
Hey, Karl, so how often are you seeing large discrepancies between field and lab? I mean, in the previous slide, there was a pretty big discrepancy for LCP, for sure.
So I have never seen field and lab be identical, but for the majority of clients, it's relatively similar, like in the same color range. But there, as we saw in that example, there are websites where the differences are extreme.
I mean, the other thing I have to always remind myself is that field data is pretty lagging, right? It's only updated every 28 days. So, I mean, you could fix something and not see the difference in your field data for some time, correct?
Yeah, and lab is instant, and you can even do it before the page is live, while field is 28 days old. Plus, if it doesn't have enough, if Google doesn't have enough traffic, they're averaging or getting the data from similar pages. So there's a lot of averaging going on in field, and it's 28 days old. And so now we have this problem, right? How do you get lab data closer to field data? Because if you don't have the lab and the field data close, you cannot rely on the feedback that you're getting from your lab data to troubleshoot things, right? Like if your field data has a CLS of 2.7 and your lab data is 0.1, then you're going to drop in ranking because you're failing it, but you don't know why you're failing it because the lab says your CLS is perfectly fine. What we have started doing is with clients is working with their developers and trying to get lab and field as close as possible. So one of the things we do, for instance, is we can either disable elements that we think are causing the differences, such as pop-ups or banners, or we use things like cookies and URL parameters to allow the Lighthouse tool that we built to pretend to be, for instance, a logged in user. So the pages that the tool runs across are actually logged in versus that's not something the page speed insights tool could do. And then we also work with the UX departments or the analytics departments. Let's look at what are your most common browsers and what are the user states for your users. And then we can find situations where, oh, for this specific browser, this moves at the last second because of some responsive design. Let's fix it so that doesn't move. And all of a sudden, even if that browser only makes up 20% of your customers, your field data might improve, where if you hadn't checked that browser, you wouldn't know that that was a problem for that specific browser. The other thing that we do is that Lighthouse gives us some lab data for diagnosing FID. For instance, max FID, which is after the first contentful paint, what is the longest running main thread blocking task, and how long does it take to fully finish, right? And what that's simulating is if a person perfectly times to click on something just at when your JavaScript task starts, how long would that person's total FID would be, right? That's an extreme case, but that's how that is calculated. And then Google also recommends total blocking time. So the way total blocking time is calculated is it looks at your main thread, looks at all the individual tasks on it, doesn't count the first 50 milliseconds and then sums everything else. So the problem with this is if you have a lot of tasks that go over 50 milliseconds, your total blocking time will not give you a good indicator of what the problem is. And so I prefer to use max FID when diagnosing things in the lab, but it's Google also heavily recommends total blocking time, which has its benefits, but I prefer max FID.
But max FID is often much higher than FID itself, right? Because because I've looked at FID and then I looked at max FID and it's way higher. So how does that help you diagnose it?
The thing that it allows me to do is to find the individual tasks that are causing it, right? Like if you have a field data FID of 100 milliseconds and your max FID is 600, that means you have a task that is running for 600 milliseconds, and then you should look at where is that task happening and can I break it into smaller pieces? And so if that task is happening before or very late, then it's unlikely to impact your field data, but it tells you which of your tasks is the most problematic. Investigate that task and see, can you break it into smaller tasks, or do you believe that it doesn't happen until so late that the chances that it has a negative experience for a customer is very low?
Thanks, that's helpful.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you guys for giving that kind of breakdown. I think that's definitely something that I think in the early conversations or early days of like core web vitals being discussed was a bit of kind of a gray zone as far as understanding what is this difference and then how should I be thinking about these two different kind of KPIs essentially for core web vitals. But kind of moving us along, so we have kind of this understanding of what's included by it, also some of the nuances with field versus lab. But if we are working on larger websites and it's easy enough, or maybe not easy enough, but it's a little more straightforward of identifying potential issues with a one page or one given URL. But how do we think about this when we're trying to address issues at scale? And Karl, what can you tell us kind of about what recommendations and how we approach kind of solving some of these issues when we're looking at a larger website or an enterprise business?
So when we work with our enterprise or larger website clients, we basically treat every single page type as its own website that requires its own analysis. As you can see here are some examples of different directories and subdirectories, and for each one, we calculated all the lab scores. And so in this case, you can see that the P directory has a significantly worse LCP value than the C directory. So even though there are slightly fewer URLs analyzed, from a priority perspective, let's look into why LCP is so much larger for P pages and how can we fix that. And so my main recommendation is treat every single page type as its own website when it comes to Core Web Vitals. That only works, though, if your page types are relatively consistent. So what we have done is we have created something we're calling the consistency score specifically for CLS, where we are calculating how consistent are the elements that are causing the CLS scores across a page type, right? And so, for instance, for C pages in this case, they're only 68.68 consistent, while for B pages, it's 0.9 consistent, right? 1 is the most consistent it could be. That would mean that every single CLS element that's causing the CLS score is the same across all the pages in the B directory. And so my recommendation is determine how consistent your page types are and make them more consistent before you fix the issue, because otherwise you might spend a lot of effort into making page type specific changes, and then after 28 days you go to the field data and the score hasn't improved because there were page specific issues that you didn't address for. And so consistency is very important when looking at individual page types for this diagnosing. The other thing we do is for every single URL we analyze, we generate one of these timelines. And so this is the same timeline as in the page speed insights, but we overlay the values, the lab values, onto the slide so you can see exactly what happened. So in this case, right, this is our website. We found out, oh, our cookies pop-up is artificially increasing our LCP score when it should be happening right here, because if the pop-up wasn't happening, our LCP element would likely be our H1 or this headline on the bottom, both of which loaded within 3 seconds. But because the pop-up takes up such a large percentage of the screen, it resets. And so in order to diagnose this page without having this visual element would take a long time. But visually, I'm very easily able to identify, oh, it's the pop-up that's causing the issue, especially since you have this whole slideshow of these timelines. And for the same page type, I have the exact same issue, that is the pop-up. And it was super easy to diagnose what the problem is. The other thing that I heavily recommend is to use the Chrome Dev tools both during production and after production. If you use the simulated network and CPU throttling with the same settings as the Lighthouse, you can get the same values that you see in the lab data in the Chrome DevTool performance timeline, and that makes it very easy to problem shoot those. And as I said, you can do that before the page goes live. As long as it's in a Chrome browser, you can run this analysis, but you have to create this little performance simulation so it's closer to the actual Lighthouse report. Otherwise, you're going to get different data and it becomes harder to troubleshoot. And if you want to diagnose individual pages, you can also use page speed insights, but that's not till after launch. And so here, for instance, is an example of a lab data Chrome Dev Tool Lighthouse report where you can see you have the two lab data fields, lab data points that you're going to get. So I know, oh, I need to work on my largest Contentful paint. And then I can go into the Chrome Dev Tools and look at where is the LCP happening? Why is it happening this late? How can I move things around so it's happening earlier? And then, as I said, the Page Speed Insights also has the individual elements that contribute to your CLS score. So if you're having trouble identifying why your lab CLS score is the way it is, Page Speed Insights will tell you literally which are the top 5 elements that contribute and how much do they contribute. We also get this data at scale via our report. So when we work with clients, we can just give them the individual HTML elements that are causing the issue, which makes it so much easier to diagnose.
Yeah, this Page Speed Insights also gives you the LCP if that's helpful as well. But I want to just mention that you got to scroll pretty far down to get to this data, and it's in gray, so you might overlook it. So just know that you can get the LCP and the top 5 elements that are causing your CLS from Page Speed Insights. You just need to scroll down to the gray section.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. That's a great point. And so how do you monitor at scale? So as we said, 28 days before field data. It takes 28 days before the field data update. So before those 28 days, you're reliant on lab data to see if your improvements made any impact. Also, as I said, if you don't have enough field data for an individual page, Google uses similar pages. And Search Console will also show you all your field data metrics and how many similar pages have the same score. If you're having a really hard time troubleshooting or monitoring individual elements, I heavily recommend the user timing API. That can get you some of the most detailed and consistent values. You just have to implement each of the timers, and I would work with your developers on that. And then, so as a summary of everything we said, remember, field data is user data. Lab data is for diagnosing problems. Consider all your data per page type instead of for the entire site. And consistency is very important per page type. And fix your problems now that you are aware of them and how to troubleshoot them, but then take that extra steps and work with your developers or your QA team, how they can monitor the different metrics during development.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Karl and Kathy. I think it's been super helpful. One, it's been really cool to see all these questions coming in and also seeing some of the familiar names and some of our clients in this webinar. So yeah, great to see all you guys out there. One thing kind of to note is that we do have a hub within the website for some of these resources. It is worth noting, and I saw several questions coming in around whether or not this is going to be made available as a recording email. Since you guys are registered, you will get a link to the recording. I know we covered a ton of material in this quick kind of 45-minute sprint here. So definitely check out the recordings. Feel free to share that with other people in your organizations. Also go back to it if you want to kind of like re-listen to certain sections. But within this hub page here, you'll also get links to the Voices of Search podcast that Karl and Kathy were both on, touching on some similar topics, little different flavor, little different way to kind of hear about the information, as well as some blog posts and some other content that we've been putting out around Core Web Vitals. So with the remainder of the time and a little bit of just a precursor is I don't think we will make it through all of the questions because really this was amazing to see all the questions coming in and almost kind of cues us up that maybe we should even just have a panel Q&A around this topic. Before we jump in, and I'm going to kind of queue up both Karl and Kathy for some of these questions, but one just really quick piece. We did get a mention for a shout out to Matt at ZGM. Happy birthday to you. Glad you're spending it with us here on the webinar. But then to kick things off in the Q&A, Kathy, I'm going to throw one over to you first. And the first question that I'd like to kind of for us to dig in a little bit deeper was from Braden at Mayo Clinic. And so Braden's question was, any tips on testing Core Web Vitals within a dev or testing web environment? Also, any tips on automating ongoing CWM measurements for field data for your users?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess Karl briefly mentioned the user timing API. So if you're looking to automate or get data, I mean, we have our tool that we can periodically run. So in some way, that's an automation solution. But yeah, you could take a look at the user timing API. You know, as far as checking it in development, I think you could still use Chrome DevTools. You're going to need to get good about simulating different environments, trying different device types, as well as setting up the throttling that Karl mentioned on a slide. I forget which slide it was, but it was a couple of them back. So that would be kind of my initial thoughts on answering that question. Karl, do you have anything to throw in?
Yeah, I think Chrome DevTools is definitely the best thing to use while development. As I said, also get your QA team involved. And for some clients, we've also started working with the UX team because in an ideal world, your UX team chooses what it believes should be the largest contentful paint element while they're designing a layout. If you can get your UX team to do that, you can straight up write in the specification, hey, developer, please make sure that this element is the largest contentful paint, and then there shouldn't be any problems with at least LCP.
Yeah, it's very important. I know you made a point of this, Karl, but it's very important to look at that load sequence. I've seen so many cases where the LCP is just really late loading. I mean, and so the FCP looks great because they're starting to paint things right away, but you know, it's like at the very last minute, the image slides in or whatever, and that makes their LCP so much worse.
Excellent. So next question we have, Karl, I'm going to throw this one over to you. So Austin from Amazon asked, how should we be thinking about Core Web Vitals in context of mobile first indexing?
So Google has announced that this is only going to become a ranking factor for mobile at the beginning. There's going to be a delay until it's rolled out for desktop. So mobile should be your main priority for it, and both Page Speed Insights and Chrome DevTools allow you to run the data for mobile specifically. So I would start with that data versus desktop data. In theory, since field data will be the ranking factor and field data is just averaging what users see, mobile first indexing won't really have an impact because it's what the customer sees while they interact with the site.
Yeah, and just a reminder to folks, I think we're going completely mobile first indexing in March, which is just around the corner. So yeah, there's probably a few sites out there that are still primarily called as desktop, but that will change in March.
Absolutely. And Kathy, I'm gonna throw this one back over to you, but Amari from Skyscanner has the question: is there any guidance on when to have performance improvements in place, considering Google's mention of May being the date?
Well, I guess the quick answer, if I'm understanding the question correctly, is yeah, you want it in place before May.
Excellent. And I mean,
you would want it 28 days at the latest before the update happens. We don't know when in May it's going to happen, but ideally you would have your field data to the point where you want it 28 days before the update happens. Otherwise, you could have some nasty surprises.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Yeah, you know, theoretically, if you get it all done like by April 30th, you should be okay. But yeah, you're a bit blind because of the lag in the field data. So ideally, yeah, it's almost like you need to have it done by the end of March.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think those are great points, especially that reiteration of the 28-day lag time. But I think another kind of component of this is we know that this will have an impact on ranking, but we're all kind of eagerly waiting to also see how significant and how much movement we'll see once the go live date happens of actually from performance. So that is going to be something that us, like you guys, are probably all on the edge of our seats for May on. I'm going to throw one over to you, Karl. So this comes in Ruby as a student. Great to see you on the webinar here. Always like seeing more interest too from the emerging students in the SEO discipline. But so Ruby has a question: do animations gift affect the CLS score?
In theory, no. In practice, it could. So if your animations are making major changes to the element's movement, especially in the viewport, it could affect CLS. GIFs, I can't think of any way off the top of my head that a GIF could affect CLS because it's a static element where things are moving inside that element, but the GIF isn't moving position on the screen, unless there are GIFs out there. I've never seen that before, but in theory, no. In practice, I'm sure someone could somehow negatively affect the CLS score with animation.
Yeah, I just want to also mention sliders. I've seen that impact LCP. It's kind of the same problem you pointed out, Karl, with the repaint scenario with the pop-up.
Absolutely. All right, so next thing we have here, John from Hubbard Round. I'm getting different results from the Search Console and page speed tests. Should we only worry about what is reported in Search Console?
Yeah, I think Karl really handled this pretty well. So the stuff in Search Console is field data. So you should take that as this is, so just to reiterate, but to make it really clear, what's going on is Google's like collecting all this data through Chrome. And then what you're seeing is kind of average results of that data for all different devices. Because as you imagine, when people interact with your site, they may be on a phone, they may be on a different phone. The phone might be challenged when it comes to processing. So what you're getting in Google Search Console is some averages and some pointers to where the problem will be. And then PageSpeed Insights, most of the time it'll show you both field and lab, but there's definitely pages you can run PageSpeed Insights on. You can run it on a URL and not get that field data. So, Google doesn't necessarily have field data for all the URLs that you have. But usually you'll get both, and you should see kind of that juxtaposition of field versus lab. So the field stuff is in the little color bars, and then the lab stuff is the results that happen underneath. And so, as Karl mentioned, field is kind of data like in Google Search Console and PageSpeed Insights. It's kind of cluing you in that you have a problem, and then you use lab data with Chrome DevTools and PageSpeed Insights to drill in where that problem might be.
And when you're comparing field data from both Search Console and PageSpeed, you might see small differences because Search Console data is an average of similar page types, while if your page has enough data in the insights, it could show different data. Or, as Kathy said, there might be a little message at the top that says, hey, we don't have enough data for this, therefore, I forgot what the exact wording is, but basically there's some summarizing if they don't have enough data. I would assume that Search Console is the best place, should be the source of truth, but remember, it's also delayed sometime, and so there's a number of factors that could cause the difference, but I would use Search Console as your source of truth when it comes to field data, unless you have API integrations that pull you the field data on a regular basis.
And right, that data is actually in BigQuery if people want to do that deep dive and figure out how to pull it out of BigQuery.
Yeah,
absolutely. And we touched on it earlier on, but obviously there's a lot of different kind of ways to get this information. And I think, one thing that we keep kind of touching on too is, don't be pigeonholed into just one source. And there's advantages and disadvantages to some of these areas, depending if you're diagnosing, looking at kind of like, well, how is it actually impacting, or what is my true field data? It's going to change a little bit from that. One kind of just quick question that I'm going to jump in on, which was kind of similar, was asking like if we could get how to get basically scores from competitors compared to our own domain. On that one, obviously, you're not going to have the Search Console and some of those field datas for other domains. But again, one thing that you can do is some of these other tools that we've mentioned, you're able to put in other URLs, And then also our approach and kind of the tool that Karl was explaining is we are looking at the top ranking domains. So we are doing that comparison, and some of those screenshots that you saw earlier in the presentation was that comparison of these were all the URLs within the top 10 rankings for the keyword set that we're analyzing, and this is how your domain is comparing to it. So I'm going to
I just wanted to jump in and just mention that there is a very nice Data Studio report that you could set up for your competitors. So there's a nice Data Studio template. All you have to do is give it the origin, so the domain, and you could get that information. The caveat, of course, is it's field data. It's delayed 28 days. And I'm sure at this point, a lot of your competitors are probably busy fixing things. So it's nice to have the tool that we've developed, which is focused on lab data, because that would be more up-to-date information.
Excellent. So we're kind of going to be coming up on the hour, but I do want to throw one more over to you, Karl. So Gwyneth Coles had the question, when working with developers, how technical do you get when providing insights and asking for updates, specifically related to site dev and design that may not be the SEO's area of expertise?
My main suggestion is to walk the developers through what your goal is, right? Like if you have an LCP element or a bad LCP score, pull up Chrome DevTools and show them, say, I need this LCP value to be here. And then they're probably, most of the time, if you have a good working relationship with them, they're going to give you options and estimates for how long that will take. So I would say visually show them what you want to accomplish and why you want to accomplish that. You do not need to go technical. You just want to explain what visually you want to see. And Chrome DevTools is amazing for that. The other great thing about Chrome DevTools Performance Timeline is that you can download the timeline and send it to your developer. So that way they don't have to rerun it and they are looking at the exact same values that you are. And that helps, in my experience, that helps a lot when communicating with developers.
Yeah, and just a reminder for people who are not totally familiar with Chrome DevTools, if you want to see that performance timeline, just click on the performance tab. Go to the URL, open up Chrome DevTools, click on the performance tab, and then do the run. So just do the just run it. So you reload the page, and then it'll run, and then wait for it, and then it will populate it, and then you can see the the core Web Vitals lane, and that can give you a lot of information on whether you have layout shifts, where your LCP is, and other factors. So yeah, start getting familiar and playing around with that if that's not something you've done already.
Excellent. Well, thank you everybody for joining us on this. There were a lot of questions that we didn't have a chance to get to. Really appreciate all of the kind of interaction during the session. And something else that with these questions that we'll be doing is we'll be posting a blog post where we'll actually go into some of these questions to have another resource for you guys. But also I'd say feel free to reach out to us for further guidance, whether you're an existing client and customer of ours. Have a conversation with your CSM or DSG member of how we could further support you. Also, if you just need some more guidance, don't hesitate to reach out. Take a look for that blog post. And then also, as a reminder, this will be made available as a video recording, so you can share it with your other team members and also give it another listen if you want to find out some more details. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Look forward to jumping back again with you guys, and we'll talk to you soon.